Okay, well, Margaret got us off to such a great start, covered so many different topics that we're going to be dealing with here today. And for this one, we are dealing with land. So last year, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Senate Bill 100, the landmark piece of legislation which established Oregon's statewide land use planning system. And every day since, the law has guided decisions across Oregon, determining what can be built where and ensuring that the diverse needs of our people are accounted for. It doesn't take a planning degree to know why such a system is necessary. Land doesn't grow on trees. Space is a finite and precious resource, and we need more of it than ever for housing. Now, certain interests, let's see who's in the room, will push the notion that expanding into greenfield areas is the answer to our housing crisis. And this position did make some inroads during this legislative session. But take a walk around any community in Oregon, and you'll quickly find that the land we're already using has a lot more potential to unlock. My three guests today are going to be exploring some potential ways to do that. Joseph Briglio is the Community Development Director for the City of Milwaukie. He is tasked with leading the city's daily development, planning, building, engineering efforts, as well as overseeing its long-range economic and housing goals. He has worked in local government for over 20 years and won awards for his creative approach to civic engagement and public service. He has helped teach graduate programs in public administration, manage affordable housing programs, environmental sustainability initiatives, a high-tech business incubator, and served in several urban planning roles and responsibilities. He holds a Master of Public Administration from the University of Southern California, a BA in Environmental Studies and Urban Planning from Sonoma State University, an Economic Development Certificate from Fresno State, and an Incubator Management Certificate from the International Business Innovation Association. In addition to his experience at the local level, Joseph has also worked regionally as the Regional Affairs Officer and Project Manager for the Southern California Association of Governments, where he partnered with dozens of municipalities to create multi-jurisdictional plans and policies that tackle the major modern issues of our time, such as housing, transportation, economic development, sustainability, and post-disaster recovery. In his spare time, Joseph enjoys travel, playing soccer, and writing in the third person. Michael Andersen is a senior housing researcher at Sightline Institute, a regional sustainability think tank for the Pacific Northwest. He serves on DLCD's Accountability Technical Advisory Committee for this year's Housing Needs Rulemaking. In 2019, he co-founded the grassroots advocacy group Portland Neighbors Welcome, which I believe is well represented in the room today. I slept an hour and a half. And finally, Becky Hewitt has more than 15 years of experience with land use, housing, and development analysis and planning in Oregon and across the country. Becky's work at ECOnorthwest focuses on evaluating development feasibility, housing strategies, and transit-oriented development. Becky advises communities on the market and development potential for a range of housing types and how to align regulations to support their local housing needs and goals. Becky has experience leading technical analysis, managing complex multidisciplinary projects, presenting to advisory bodies and decision makers, and designing and implementing public and stakeholder engagement. Becky joined ECOnorthwest in 2018 after a decade of working in urban planning and land use analysis, including corridor revitalization plans, concept plans for developing areas, development code audits, and updates and housing analyses. Becky has graduate degrees in both urban planning and real estate development. So after that mouthful, please welcome my panel. All right.
Great. Thank you, Sam. I was always told never to follow a keynote speaker, so thank you. I'm Joseph Briglio, Community Development Director for the City of Milwaukie, and I'm going to walk through a real-life project that we're currently in the process of that's called Sparrow. It's kind of like a CIA operative kind of name, but it's really just the name of a street. And for a property that is a brownfield that we're trying to unlock the potential. So pay attention because you also might be able to help us unlock that potential. So jumping right in, I don't assume that any of y'all know where Milwaukie is. Before I worked there, I didn't know. I drove around it, through it, but didn't fully understand, saw signs for it. But just in case there are those that don't really know where Milwaukie is, it's the yellow amoeba, kind of right in the middle of the metro. It's just below, touching the great city of Portland. It is adjacent to the neighborhoods of Selwood, Eastmoreland, Westmoreland, and a few others. It is also surrounded, it's in Clackamas County. It's also surrounded by unincorporated Clackamas. So just a little bit of unique jurisdictional boundaries there. More context, Milwaukie, and you know what? The shout out to my fellow panelists here. ECOnorthwest, Becky, I think this is your work, actually.
I recognize this.
Yes. So ECOnorthwest helped us recently with our buildable lands inventory and housing capacity analysis and housing production strategy. And this slide just to show you that Milwaukie is an old jurisdiction, old city, old infrastructure, mostly built out. So what you're seeing here is just a map of the unconstrained vacant properties. Doesn't mean the white space isn't developable. It just means that just takes a little bit more tact to develop that property. So as you can see, it's mostly built out. There's some dots of medium density residential, kind of your single family type of stock. Then you have that fuchsia color. We have a few large parcels that are able to have mixed use or, higher density apartments. So most of our properties are built out or in the process of building. We have some amazing projects going on in Milwaukie. I won't get to those, but we actually do. But the truth is that most of our future housing need is going to be addressed through infill and redevelopment and aggregation of these cut up parcels that are sporadic throughout our jurisdiction. Luckily, with HB 2001, climate friendly equitable communities legislation that's come down, it makes things a lot more interesting for our community. And it's going to help us, and we're going to get into some of the why in a second, but essentially because of where transit lines are located throughout the city, our entire, like 90+% of our city doesn't require off-street minimum parking standards. Very unique. Most cities will still have some kind of those requirements, but for the city of Milwaukie, those are like gone. So we actually only have maximums off-street parking requirements. The other part is that HB 2001 middle housing legislation. We adopted a code that's pretty progressive when it comes to our fellow colleague cities in the sense that we allow, if you can design it to meet our design standards for cottage clusters, plexes, townhomes, things of that nature, there's no density maximum. Like, so parcels that were once, one home can now possibly have 4, 5, 6, just a matter of design. And that'll play a role in what I'm about to speak to next, and that is the Sparrow site. So just to get closer and closer to what I'm actually going to speak about today is Sparrow is a triangular site. It's right in between two Orange Line stops in Oaks Lodge into the north, downtown Milwaukie, and just left of the Willamette River, adjacent to McLaughlin. It's in the Island Station neighborhoods. I think what's interesting to this, it's in a community for Milwaukie standards that's pretty affluent. So just that's more context, right? In 2014, it's a 1.4 acre site. In 2014, this gives you a sense that it was used historically by TriMet for construction staging. There's some vehicle staging. There's some material staging. And what I love about this photo is it shows you right next to McLaughlin is the Orange Line's going in. It's being built. And by the way, like there was political lives lost in the Orange Line coming through Milwaukie. So big shout out to those that said yes and then lost their position. But it's coming through. Trolley Trail's the kind of the dirt patch next to what you see there, and then the star is obviously the property itself. And this is actually turning into a brownfield as you were watching on screen. It is happening right here. Soil contamination. So 2016, just to show you it complete, trolley trail's complete, looks nice. Orange Line's in, and this site is mostly vacant now. With the thing that's left is petroleum diesel now has contaminated the soil. And it's around this time. Here's the property too. There's no trespassing, just so you know. But to get a sense of the ground view, it's kind of a great property when you look at it. It's flat, right? That's pretty amazing. There is some significant slope on the left side and some old growth vegetation and trees, and then the back, far back, same. But for the most part, pretty flat. It's kind of on just the eye test makes you go, yeah. And speaking of the eye test, two counselors, there's one in this room as we speak. Counselor Falconer at the time and Mayor Gamba. Angel's right here, just so you know. Yeah. Well done, because I want to give them the credit to start asking the right questions once construction ended. And they saw this site just sitting there and going, well, what now, TriMet? What are you going to do next with that site? Could the city potentially purchase that site and do something amazing with it? We have a housing crisis. Maybe we could do something to meet that housing crisis. And so discussions started back in 2017 and through a couple years of going back and forth, also inviting developers to the site to take a look at and answer questions of like, you know, what could you do here? Like just dream a little bit. It's a small site. It's got some constraints. What's possible? Doing the due diligence process for a couple years. And then also shout out to Alma Flores, my predecessor, Leila Aman, my predecessor to on the staff side for also just marching this along too, in case you're out there. Hey, they also were able to get some answers from the constraint side as far as mediation, what type of mediation will occur, because Metro was also doing a brownfields environmental phase 1 and 2 analysis along McLaughlin at the time. And we were able to jump on that and get basically phase 1 and phase 2 for this property and truly understand the issues with it. So just fast forwarding a little bit, years pass, we actually are able to make a deal with TriMet, understand some of the environmental hazards. And we had to purchase this property for $35,000, which is, yeah, right? Like there's some like, what? It's like a no-brainer. Come on. Amazing government, right? Come on. There's shout out to amazing government and having some forward thinking to be like, let's make a deal. And to TriMet for making that deal with us. I'll come back to this in a second. But I love this because after we purchased, city council started dreaming and started thinking about what type of things, what do we want to see there? So what are the goals for that? A few counselors were already ahead of the curve, but bring in the body to actually direct staff and the city what it wanted to do. And we came up with these 8 goals, or I should say city council came up with these 8 goals, adopted over a series of council meetings. And I won't read it line by line, but as you can see, I mean, affordability, deeply affordable. We're talking 0 to 30% AMI, so deeply, deeply affordable. Units that would have 2 to 3 bedrooms to allow for larger groups, larger families. Minority women-owned enterprise contracting through the construction and the whole design phases. Tree preservation, that's a value of the cities. We have a great tree code, just so you know, in pursuit of tree canopy throughout the city. To meet our climate goals, sustainable design, green materials, sustainable materials, and designing to meet energy standards. Affirmative outreach, so ensuring that once those are built, that we actually are marketing to those that are unrepresented and don't usually get the first chance and first opportunity for affordable housing developments. So making sure that's part of our goals. And also city no financing, so don't touch our pockets. That was a goal. And then finally, project delivery, faster the better. So to encapsulate all those goals, all the things, right? The council wanted all the good things. Like these are goals to really shoot for, and hats off to actually going, yeah, we want to include all of the important values of our city and to give hopefully an amazing development to those that are in the most need. So through that process of describing goals and where we wanted to go, we also learned about more constraints. So we knew about the brownfield, right? We did some assessment there. So we knew kind of what that would incorporate, and answering that question would be either capping a portion of it, also removing fill or moving soil as part of the design and construction process. We can do that with a remedial action plan and work with the developer on that side. Other thing that we kind of had to wait for was it was zoned really low density, medium density, single family type of zoning at the time. It still is. And so we knew that the legislation was coming and that we could just wait because we're doing an upzone on this and where it's at. And Councilor Falconer could speak to it, as well as it would be challenging, and for a number of reasons, politically, process-wise, administratively, to get that through. And so at the time said, let's just wait for middle housing to come and see what we can be design, what type of densities we can get then. Because really to unlock the financing for a developer, it's got a pencil. And at the time, we're talking 6 to 7 units. But now that we've adopted our middle housing code and the parking code with CFAC, we're looking at 25 units potentially by right. So it changes the whole dynamic just like that overnight. So it was wise to wait, so we don't have to have that battle now, even though, yeah, time has passed. So yeah, okay, we answered that question, that concern. The last one is a big one, and that's access. The roads around it. So there's 25, the 25th, there's Sparrow, and there's 26th. And we didn't realize this, but Sparrow is pretty steep and also pretty constrained in itself. And then 26 we thought was a right of way, like a public right of way. And so we're like, oh, there's 2 roads going in, great. Come to find out that like 26th is actually, no, it's private property. People just use it to go right through. And so there became this issue of access. If you're going to build density and really unlock density and housing for this property, then you need to build the infrastructure, which was just talked about before me. And so therefore, not just for one path, but also 2 paths for fire safety access. And instead of eating up the property itself with like hammerheads for fire truck turnarounds and stuff, we started thinking about, okay, well, how do we unlock this issue of access? And I'll just, there's some slope. This is the driveway in my sweet ride going to the project site. So I'd be standing on the property. But here's 26th Avenue. Looks like a driveway. It's about 15 feet wide. And again, most of that's just private property, but it looks like, go for it. Like it looks like it's open to the public. But here's a better idea of really what we were dealing with. So you see 26th Avenue, so here's the tax map. See how it just bumps right into the Sparrow auxiliary lot, as we call it. There's no access there. And surprise, surprise, instead of having to go through an acquisition of private property and just dealing with that, this also happened to be a TriMet property, and we just did a deal with them. So we thought maybe they'd make us another deal. They didn't make it as sweet as far as the amount, but we did purchase this property back in 2023, last year, able to sign that deal so that we could own that potential right away in the future and have our destiny kind of under our own control. And through that, we also did an access study. This is, just some ways we could figure out how to expand that infrastructure and create the access. So there you have it. That's still to be coming. So just to give you kind of the perspective, this has been a long time coming. Some people have wanted it to go faster, and it's, I'm one of them, but it's also, it's like it's an onion in sorts. And sometimes this happens with development. You uncover one problem and you answer it, only to find another one. So here we are at 2024, but you can kind of see each step of the way every year kind of hitting a significant issue. These are not easy things, especially for a government. I mean, we're a small and not a rich government in Milwaukie. So really trying to figure out funding to buy property, to land bank property, to create infrastructure projects, it's unique. It's really pressed us. And so leveraging partnerships is going to be key as we move into 2024 and surplus property hearings with our council, basically saying, yep, these properties are surplus. So now it's going to be open to RFQ for developers. So this is a commercial now. So if there's developers out there that are interested in potentially joining the RFQ of the future, pay attention. We're opening it to issue an RFQ later this year. Developer owner selection 25, some public engagement, site design, remedial action plan because of the soil contamination will be a part of that. And then 26 is kind of when the rubber meets the road, permitting construction. So it's a big endeavor for a small little community, but we are really trying. And again, thanks to those elected at the time, their legacy is going to be eventually made in some amazing affordable housing that really meets the biggest need in our community. So that's a little bit of that. Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate it.
I hope I'm next.
Pocket slides. Don't pay attention.
All right. No, okay, great. Cool. Thanks, Joseph. My name is Michael Andersen. I'm with Sightline Institute. I'm going to talk to you a bit about four-story apartment buildings, why they're so great, and identify a problem related to them. They're illegal. And then talk a little bit about a fairly specific proposal for how to change that. So I invite feedback later. But to start out with, I'm a researcher with Sightline Institute. We're a sustainability think tank. I focus on housing and transportation. I'm going to be turning this mic a lot, so I'm just going to do this. And one of Sightline's beliefs is that people should get to live near each other if they want to, put simply. That's in part because you can cut your energy in half voluntarily just by doing so. And we think that's good for everybody. Anybody who wants to do so should get to do so. My premise today is that four-story apartment buildings are awesome. If you don't agree with that, I respect that. I don't know how you landed at this conference, but cool. Let's talk about that later. But I'm not going to question that premise for now. Instead, I'm going to tell you very briefly why this is the one that's closest to my own place. This is the Milwaukie Tokati by NEA at 47th or 42nd and going. It's 50 units, 56 units on a little less than half an acre. And one of the great thing about four-story apartment buildings is they are the minimum viable scale for a LIHTC grant, which supported this. If you have a 10,000 square foot lot, you need it to be on 4 stories or so, or else LIHTC isn't going to help with your project. And it's probably not going to happen. This is the Clara Flats up in Camas on the other side of the river. This is the densest photo you'll see in this sequence, 30 homes on 5,000 square feet. Here's the Dahlia in Canby, 2nd Avenue right by downtown, 69 homes, pretty big homes, long block building, but the newest apartment building there in a long time. This is one of my favorite things about a 4-story apartment building zone is it can also be a 3-story apartment building zone. This is in Newburgh. This is 19 homes on a 1/4 acre there, built a few years ago. And also right by downtown, walking distance of everything. Which brings me to this point about 4-story apartment buildings, which is that they are in this very productive part of the slope. As you're moving away from automobile dependence, you get a lot of progress as you go from a 4-plex, for example, to a 4-story apartment building. You get less progress as you go past that. So let's focus our energy, if we're trying to reduce energy use, among other things, on this part of the slope. This is cost per square foot for construction. You can see the number of building stories along the bottom, and you can see 3 stories is very cheap. That's great. 4 stories goes up a little bit in price, but it's still quite affordable. And this doesn't include land costs, of course. This is construction per square foot. One of the reasons that bumps up at 4 stories is one of my favorite things about 4-story buildings is elevators are typically in a 4-story building. And so if you want elevators to pencil, it's important to get another stop on the elevator. And in the next 50 years, I and probably many of you will probably be glad when there are more elevators in Oregon, hopefully. Also, I think they're just pretty nice. You know, they're not too scary. They don't loom. They fit right into a neighborhood. Even a robot knows why. It's from Midjourney. The other key to think about, I would say politically, here's this gray bar on the right. That is how fast we would need to build housing in Oregon to meet Governor Kotek's housing target in the next few years. So the only amalgam to that is the only analog to that we can think of is the 70s. And in the 70s, we built a lot more apartment buildings than we are building now in Oregon or have built since, including in this last decade where we've all been so excited about it in the urban areas. Many, many more apartment buildings built in the 70s. We are going to have to figure out how to do that again. And to do that, I think we're going to have to embrace apartment zoning. Got a problem with the slide here, but the problem here is that Oregon builds very few apartment buildings. Here is new homes permitted in just 5+ unit structures by county in Oregon. You can see it falls off pretty sharply, and we're looking at fewer than 100 units a year in many of these counties. This is an average rate from 2010 to 23. Why is this? Maybe it's that people only like to live near each other in Multnomah County. Maybe that's the reason. On the other hand, it might be that it's illegal in almost every other part of the state, including a lot of Portland, Oregon, to have a 4-story apartment building. So I'm going to detail that in this next part of the presentation, exactly how illegal it is in a few cases. A lot of Oregon's apartment zones are unusable. So I've been focusing just in the last few months on trying to quantify exactly how common it is to have 4-story apartment building zoning, and it is very uncommon. This is Tualatin, great town, well-intentioned folks, I think a relatively pro-housing council. You can see the deeper yellow, of course, those are the higher density zones here, the medium high and the high density. It's hard to tell the difference, but they're both clustered on each side of this central part of the map. If you look at the medium high density RMH zone, we've got 15 units per acre. That is the maximum density of the zones. That's not going to be good for an apartment building, and the maximum structure height, 35 feet, 3 stories. This is in the high density zone. The maximum height in the high density apartment zone, 35 feet in Tualatin. You can go higher as a conditional use if you have a setback up to 50 feet. Sorry, 75 feet from the street. This is Albany. Moving down, you can see the cluster of multifamily zones by the river there, sort of top center of the map. What's the zoning allow there? The various parts of the zone are pretty liberal, and then you go further and you see the minimum lot size per unit doesn't go below 1,600 square feet per unit. So you can build on a 10,000 square foot lot, you could build up to 7 units in their apartment zones in Albany. This is not a surprise to many of you, but I think it's useful to just go through and document how illegal apartments are in so much of Oregon. Move down the coast to Coos Bay. Coos Bay's zoning is relatively more permissive, relatively more welcoming in their multifamily area. You can see the purple cluster over on the sort of lower right side of this map. Do I have a laser? I do, yeah, right here. The problem there is not in the height and unit count. There's no maximum unit count. That's cool. No, it's in the parking. 1.5 parking spaces per dwelling unit in a county or in a city where half of tenants have 0 or 1 car is also going to make it impossible to build this building. It was not affected by the CFEC rules because it's not in MPO, but it is a place that's banning apartment buildings, maybe by mistake, because it's requiring that much parking. So let's go through an exercise of defining what is a real apartment zone. I'm sorry about the slide problem here, but let's think about what a real apartment zone would look like. I took this building and retconned that into zoning. And so like, what would it take to build this building by my place if we needed to? We would need something like 45 feet of height, 3.5 FAR, 150 to 200 units per acre. We can be vague on that. Nobody's coming close in almost anywhere. And mandatory parking below 0.75 spaces per unit. Not no parking, but not too much parking either. I looked at the zones. This is the generalized zoning database for the Portland metro area. Metro makes it easy to look this up in bulk. So we did. Here's what we found. It's almost everywhere illegal to build a 4-story apartment building. The highest performer here is Portland at 17% of residential land, followed by Oregon City, about 15%. Hillsborough, Milwaukee's down there a little bit. Nice job, Joseph. And then we've got quite a few that are off the right side of the chart at 0, including Lake Oswego, Tualatin, et cetera. And if you look at where it is in the city, even more depressing, these light bars, that's where it is within 300 meters of a freeway. And I'll summarize the public health findings to you. That's where it's very dangerous to live. And yet this is where we're concentrating our zoning that is dedicated specifically to light-tech uses and generally lower priced market rate housing. It's a pretty big problem, I would say. It's 4.5 times more likely to be dangerously close to freeway pollution if you live in this type of zone. Beyond the Portland metro, I'll quickly blow through Eugene, 8%, not bad. Albany, 0. Medford, 0. Redmond, 0% of residential land allows this, what I'm calling a real apartment building zone. So a possible solution to that, I'm going to close with this, and this is going to get a little bit ridiculously specific, but it's here for the sake of argument. Let's think about the model of middle housing. I think it was a big success for the state, like a really weirdly big governance success, the implementation of the middle housing bill. And I think that's because of a few characteristics, a few ingredients that we included in that. One is that the state very clearly defined compliance for cities. It said exactly, this is how you qualify. You are good if you do this level of stuff. It set a very clear deadline. You have to do it by the July 2022 or else something happens. And on that note, the consequences are predictable and proportional. So it says, this is exactly what's going to happen. That's what the statute says. This will happen for sure. And it's going to be more or less what you need to do anyway. So you may as well do it your own way. That's how it worked. Finally, the state offered technical help and funding for this to actually happen for cities that don't have the swing to do it easily. The results of that were 100% compliance. Everybody essentially met the deadline. There were no massive political attempts to repeal or even to really defy the state legally over this. And we have now dozens of similar bills across the country, including several in Washington and elsewhere that have passed. It's a pretty big success, I think, and something we can learn from in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. If we were to fit the goal of allowing more four-story apartment zoning into the ONA process, this is an idea for what it might look like. This is what bureaucracy looks like. This is a great image that summarizes the process of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. I'm going to very much simplify it here. So 3 steps. City accelerates production up here. And it's very important. This is like, I think, underappreciated. It's not city hits targets. It's just city accelerates production. If Joseph and his colleagues can keep doing good work and keep accelerating production in their own way, that's the best outcome. And that is great. And that is what we should be encouraging cities to come up with their own local ways to do good stuff. The second best outcome and the second next step in this flow chart is the city shows it's doing what it can. Not necessarily accelerating production, but doing what you can. That is the requirement of the sequence. And then finally, if not, the state tells the city what to do. And that's like, let's avoid that if we can. That's not ideal. That's how we're going to get backlashes. That's how we're going to get lawsuits. What we should be designing our system to do, I would argue, is to make it very clear what's going to happen so that the city does what it can if it can't figure out how to make things work as well as it needs to on its own under its conditions. If we map that onto the flow chart I showed you before, this city shows what it's doing, what it can step. This is the crucial decision of whether to refer the city to the housing acceleration program. And it seems to me that this step, this decision, which is not well defined by the statute, but could be well defined by rulemaking, if that can be inspired by our middle housing law, then I think it can be quite successful. I think if we can take the ingredients of that successful middle housing law that set clear deadlines, clear compliance, clear consequences. I see Sean grimacing. But to the extent that we can do this and associate with technical help and funding, then I think we have a chance of making a success and helping cities show that they are doing what they can, which would be to, among many other things, allow four-story apartment buildings to exist. Next slide.
All right. Okay. Michael, it's a tough act to follow too. I really just want to get into some of the things that he just talked about, but I was asked to talk about infrastructure as an important ingredient to unlocking infill. So that's what I'm going to do. When I talk about infrastructure, there's a couple of different pieces. All of these I am including in what I mean by infrastructure to support development. I'm talking about on-site infrastructure. That's like the frontage, the street frontage in front of the property, the utility laterals that hook up to the property, stormwater management on-site. There's also, maybe you need to extend the utility main down the street. Maybe you need to improve a nearby street or intersection. There's also the fee component, system development charges, and in some cases, a fee in lieu of doing something like a fee in lieu of improving the intersection or a fee in lieu of improving the street. All of those are part of the infrastructure package. Why does that affect development? Well, there's the cost part that seems obvious, but even at that, it actually can be more than just the cost of the infrastructure itself, because maybe in order to put in a sewer pipe, you also have to cut open the street, put in the pipe, repair the street, that adds costs. Maybe you also have to do the design and engineering for that, that adds costs. Maybe you also have to finance that at private sector construction loan financing rate, that adds cost. There's also a lot of uncertainty. What exactly am I going to be required to install here? And what is that going to cost? There's a lot of risk of cost overruns, and that those costs are not known at the time the developer is doing their pro forma early in the game. It's pretty hard to fully account for those. There can be a lot of surprises. Developers do not like late breaking expensive surprises. There's also the time component. Going through the process to work with the jurisdiction to figure out, what am I going to have to build? What is it going to have to look like? That takes a lot of time, and time is expensive. So I'm going to talk about some examples of infrastructure barriers that we've seen in our work, that we've heard. I went back through 5 years of developer interview notes, and it's surprising how often this came up. Or maybe it's not surprising, but it came up a lot. So we did some work for Washington County looking at middle housing specifically. And we did some testing of how the viability of building middle housing changed, depending on whether they had to improve their street frontage or not. Washington County at the time had a rule that a new single family home did not have to improve its street frontage. And they were debating whether middle housing should have to improve street frontage or not. So we tested how much of a difference did that make. It made a pretty decent difference. It especially made a difference if you were on a corner lot and you had a lot of street frontage relative to the number of units. We also heard examples of this from developers that were in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range for a couple of units. That's kind of a lot of money for just a couple of units to absorb on top of all of the normal costs. This happens to be a friend's property. They were looking at building on this property, decided they were looking at building for themselves, decided not to, and have been trying to figure out a way to develop it. But the site doesn't have sewer. The sewer is only really a block away, but they got an estimate that would be about $150,000. And then the local street needs improvement. Portland actually does offer an in lieu fee to just pay a fee instead of going out and building that street. That's great. It was still going to be at $81,000. And they're zoned for 6 units, even with middle housing, because they're not on a city maintained street. So they don't have, this is still sitting here. It's probably going to sit here for a while longer. It actually has one house on it that is not in use. That's been partly demoed. It's going to sit there for a while longer and not produce housing because it just doesn't work. We also worked with the city of Newport on what they called a constructability analysis. They wanted to know which of their vacant lands could afford the infrastructure it would take to hook them up and make them developable. We looked at greenfield sites that were already in their UGB, and we also looked at a couple of infill sites. This is one of them. Collectively across these properties, there's capacity for something like 23 units, but it needs $780,000 worth of infrastructure, even for this infill area. Just extend the streets, extend the sewer, et cetera. We actually found that if all of that area kind of were to go at once and everybody was pooling the cost of that development, it might just barely work. But it's fragmented ownership. That's probably not how it's going to play out. And so that's going to make it a lot harder. We also looked at, for Newport, would it help to increase the density on this site? For their market conditions, it actually didn't, because the margins get enough thinner for the higher density product in Newport that actually made things worse, not better. That's not true everywhere, but it was true for them. They actually couldn't solve this by increasing the density. There are other places where the fire flow or water pressure is a problem. So Newburgh, I believe, I'm not 100% sure on this, is the only place in the state that had to do an infrastructure-based time extension request for House Bill 2001, meaning we can't put middle housing here yet because the infrastructure limitations are so severe that we need some time. And it was because of fire flow. And they carved out 2 areas in the city where they did not have adequate fire flow, and they delayed implementation of middle housing in those 2 areas. We heard similar things from another jurisdiction where they had a couple of neighborhoods that have water pressure limitations and they've got something in the works that's going to take care of it. But for right now, if a developer wants to move forward, put in your own lift station or wait. And then it's also the on-site component can also make a difference. So whether every individual unit has to install its own lateral out to a street and they all have to go next to each other and they take up space on the site because they have to go next to each other, or whether you can share a lateral and then go off of that, that makes a difference in cost and in how many units can fit sometimes. And then also whether you have to, like cottage cluster can allow you to not have to put public street in front of every unit so you can save on the street costs as well. So those on-site costs make a difference when you're just building a handful of units as well. So what jurisdictions can do to help? There's a couple of different types of things to think about. None of these are easy. There's never a silver bullet in any of this stuff. But are there opportunities to adjust the standards? Is there something more you can do on cost sharing? Are there regulations? Are your regulations in a place where increasing density might help? And is there something you can do on the process side that reduces the uncertainty? Because overall, if this is going to work, you've got to balance the cost with the development potential, or nothing is going to happen. So how you do that depends on the scale that you're working at and whether you've got one focus area or you've got a bunch of little sites scattered around that all need different little things. If you have a bunch of sites that all need different little things, sometimes they just need these really localized improvements. They need to run the sewer, 100 feet or 200 feet. That sewer line may or may not benefit anybody else. It's probably not in your SDC project list. It's just a little thing that one property needs. And that cost may be the size of your professional services budget for the year, but it's a big deal to the developer. And it also can be problematic because if you try to put all the costs on the developer, you can get into rough proportionality issues. You're maybe putting more on them than is really proportionate to the development. If you have a bigger redevelopment area, the costs are bigger. Now we're talking millions of dollars in a lot of cases. You might need to focus more on your multimodal improvements, try to make it a place that supports higher density. You're probably looking at public-private partnerships, and you need some political will and you need some strong leadership to make these things happen. So different kinds of solutions. If you're looking at small scale infill, things like the fee in lieu, like Portland's local transportation improvement charge, that means that you're not installing sidewalks to nowhere. You're paying in something that then the city can prioritize where to put sidewalks on local streets that don't have it and do it in a more efficient way. And then I know the rules are kind of set on who has to have shared laterals and who doesn't for middle housing. But to the extent that it's possible to allow middle housing to use shared laterals, we've heard that over and over and over again from developers that makes a big difference on cost, and that some folks are not doing the thing that we all kind of thought they would of doing middle housing land divisions because of that cost. And because they are better off to stick with doing condos and all the problems with doing condos than to pay for the cost of those separate laterals. So that's a big deal if we can figure out a way to work on that. And then if there are areas that have localized deficiencies and they affect multiple properties that all have infill potential, local improvement districts aren't easy necessarily, but they're a way to spread those costs around and to recognize that they benefit people who are developing and people who are not developing. So there's just something to think about. And then if you have something like a fire flow limitation, thinking about how you're prioritizing those capital improvement program dollars and what you could unlock by addressing some of those bigger capacity limitations. And then on the fee side, system development charge rate structure, have you thought about whether everybody paying the same amount makes sense? Have you adjusted for the fact that maybe small units have a smaller impact? Maybe your infill areas have a smaller impact on kind of the broader system than your greenfield areas. So something to think about. For a larger scale redevelopment, the thing you're likely to run into is maybe more on the transportation impact analysis. What are you requiring these folks to do? Are you getting into like big intersection improvements that they have to make? Or are you focusing on how they're going to make multimodal improvements that are going to support that redevelopment into a higher density area? Tax increment financing isn't perfect, but it's a really powerful tool to pay for the infrastructure you need to really transform an area. The jurisdictions that I've seen that have tax increment financing as a tool have a lot more that they can bring to bear and a lot more they can do to help on the infrastructure costs. And then public-private partnerships and development agreements can also be really helpful there. And then for a bigger developer, the way that the SDC credits work, if you get credit for building the project, is really important because they're more likely to be the one building the project, and they need to know as clearly as possible upfront how much credit they're going to get for that. And if you have key projects on the list that they will get credit for, that can really help with getting them built. And then on the land use side, so there's some different, the way this shakes out is going to be different in different communities. Sometimes spreading a fixed cost across more units makes a big difference. If it is basically the same cost to install the sewer, whether you're building 10 units or 25 units, you would probably rather build 25. But you got to test the value of density. In some places, density has a lot of value. In some places, density has negative value because you move away from a thing that has value and into a thing that's really hard, has very thin margins. And if you can't spread the costs effectively, you got to realize that sometimes those costs are going to get passed on. Some types of housing can absorb the costs getting passed on more than others. That means if you can't spread those costs, the developers might have to push the top of market. I just heard this from somebody literally yesterday, that because of the cost of infrastructure, they had to push their home prices up. It was in a community where they can do that. They can sell the homes for $1 million. They would rather have sold them for 900. That's still very expensive. But the difference between 900 and $1 million is like, that works for some people. So they push the top of the market on those home prices and they pass those costs along. And then at some point, you have to look at whether the things that you're allowing are viable given the infrastructure that you're asking them to carry. And that might be a balance of some things that can absorb a lot of costs and some things that you really need that maybe can't absorb a lot of costs, but help spread costs over more units. And so you got to kind of find a mix that can make the cost bearable, or you've got to come in with money. And then the uncertainty, I don't know how many times we've heard about struggles with public works and engineering, all great people, I'm sure, but a lot of challenges getting to a conclusion about what you have to build and getting things approved and getting through the process. And so the things that we've heard where developers said, you know, this was really great, this made a difference. Having some clarity up front on exactly what was going to be required, having a really collaborative process. Some of the small towns that we've talked to folks in, they said it was so great. They got the whole group together. They got engineering, they got planning, they got everybody in the room, and they just told us what was going to be required and stuck to that. And it was so easy. And we would go back here and build anytime. And Public Works tends to have other things on their plate. This may not be their top priority, but trying to build some consensus with them and support to as much as possible streamline this process and not be the holdup. That can help. So there's not a lot of easy answers here, but the bottom line is if you want the infill to work, you've got to find ways to reduce the costs, reduce the risk, and or reduce the delay that from infrastructure that's being put on the development, or increase the development's ability to pay. And the best way to get to that is going to depend on the context and depend on kind of what tools you have available, what the barriers are, and what the market looks like. That's it.
All right, thank you so much. I can't believe we've got this much time for questions. This is fantastic. So we are changing up the rules a little bit. Ben Schonenberg is going to be taking the mic around because I care about my fellow board members' dreams and aspirations, and his was to be Oprah. So if you are interested in asking a question and you happen to be in the room, just raise your hand. He'll come to you. First, I'm going to take some moderator prerogative. Okay, so if you are watching from the Zoom live stream right now, please put your questions in the Q&A. We got one from Terry Harding. Will there be an orange station nearby? I'm guessing this is for you, Joseph. Do you know if there's going to be a new station at the Sparrow site?
Yeah, for the Sparrow site, it's in between two already, so I don't believe there will be another addition to it.
Great. Well, my first question is for you. So I didn't realize just how close the Sparrow site was to one of my favorite places in the Portland Metro, which is Elk Rock Island.
Get out.
Fantastic. But one problem with Elk Rock Island, if anyone has gone out there, is just how horrible the parking is in a single family residential neighborhood. And it's very heartening to see that affordable development is going to be within walking distance to this really, really, I mean, one of the best green spaces that we have in the Portland Metro. I'm wondering, as you come from a management side, you're choosing where to direct these dollars. When you look at housing development, is it any port in a storm, like wherever this brownfield is like, well, this is what we've got to work with? Or are you willing to commit more money to a project that happens to be closer to a quality green space, for instance?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's definitely part of our calculation in these efforts, especially when it comes to affordable income restricted housing, is having some amenities close by instead of it just being a privilege. Like actually living in a privileged neighborhood is only for a certain few, that actually providing similar amenities across our city. But it's certainly, yeah, that's a part of it. It's part of our discussions. It's part of our calculation and all this. The brownfield element is just, it was inexpensive. That's a fantastic thing to do. And as far as land values go, it's ridiculous at this point to the deal we got. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, this is a rare sequel. You know, your presentation was a rare sequel. Real HLA heads out there will know that Angel, when she was still a city councilor, gave a presentation at this conference on Orange Line. And I think it was, if I remember right, it was specifically around some of the community resistance issues that you faced. So my pitch to you, be sure to be here for the next panel, because Angel is going to be talking about those issues even more in regards to housing. I'm very excited about it. So please stick around for that. Michael, we have a panel later today that is going to get into accessibility. So I'm not asking you to go too deeply into it, but you've done some really great research around accessible units as it regards to middle housing. How do you see apartments filling the very serious backlog that we have of accessible units?
Right. We have, as you say, a very serious backlog and a very serious front log, as it were, of accessible units, as many more of us are going to be having bad hips in the next few years. But I think I respect greatly the work of the many people fighting to improve the building standards for new buildings. And I always am uncomfortable to say, I think there are trade-offs there. We need to weigh the excellence of the new building against the probability that the old building stays there in place. And if we're not putting the requirement on the old building, then we're really privileging the status quo. That said, I think that a big part of the case for apartment zoning is that it is going to have a quite high standard of accessibility, especially if you can get an elevator in there with the fourth story and more. And more broadly, in an area less contemplated by federal law, the location is going to potentially be a more hospitable place to somebody with mobility challenges, whether that's sight or motor ability or whatever. So I would argue that we should be thinking about the location within the community of the structures and therefore of the zoning, in addition to the characteristics of the structures.
Great. Let's mix it up. Anyone in the room? I have some online. Okay. Oh, yeah.
So Guy Ben from TriMet. I have a question and it relates to infrastructure. And I manage the TOD program at TriMet, but one of the problems that we regularly encounter when we're selling sites, not with the Sparrow site incidentally, but is that, you know, our sites sit on major transit corridors or major transit streets. And therefore, to develop those sites, the developers or TriMet or somebody has to find additional money to reroute infrastructure or cross zoning and code boundaries or address them to do that. And obviously it sort of conflicts with the overall desire to put housing near transit. So how do we address that?
Yeah, well, great question. You can see by us all really chomping at the bit to answer it. What I can say is that I don't think there's a desire to really build, you know, TOD aside and on top transit corridors because of some of the health reports that in the studies that we've seen to unlock that development is challenging and curious, and there's that issue. But I will say, and just in context of the Sparrow site, for us, the city, if I can speak on our behalf, it's inexpensive land, and we can figure out maybe how to answer those issues of health and safety as a community that's living there versus, I don't know. I don't know if that even answers your question. I'm actually just trying to walk around it a little bit. So forgive me. I don't know if my panelists have any
Nothing,
other
I got
insights
nothing.
there.
I guess I think that if we're putting the higher density zoning in the places where we have transit, and then that hopefully things like a street improvement are not that like making, hopefully at that point it's already transit. It's got the right transit improvements on it. And we're talking about infrastructure that is not really about the transportation infrastructure. That's not always the case. I think it's ironic if you end up in a situation where to develop the property on the transit street, you have to make it like you have to pay more to make it more transit friendly. I think that if that's something that, you know, we need to think about what the kind of partnership opportunities are there. So hopefully that sort of something like a requirement for wider sidewalk or to install a nice shelter. I think if we're going to put a higher design requirement on what that infrastructure looks like, and then we're going to ask the development to carry that cost, I think we need to figure out ways so that we can get the nice, you know, street cross section or the nice shelter, but also not penalize people for putting the development where we actually want them to put it. And so I think there are a number of places where it would be nice to pair some infrastructure funding with some affordable housing funding and things like that, so that it's not a penalty to invest in the infill area or in the transit-oriented development area. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question, but I think that trade-off between trying to make the infrastructure as nice as possible and trying to get the housing in there or get the housing to be as affordable as possible. Sometimes there's things to balance.
I mean, I think that that's a really interesting tension that exists to, you know, Michael's analysis of how much apartments are already within 300 meters of a freeway. Guess where the max is built in most of the metro. So yeah, you have this underlying tension, and maybe when we think about infrastructure, we also need to think about environmental mitigation as a piece of that, you know, to relate it to another 2020 panel topic about the development in Lens Town Center. Just a year later, during the heat dome, Lens Town Center ended up being the hottest place, you know, in the country. And, you know, in large part because there was not enough environmental mitigation, at least at the time, to handle, you know, a weather event like that.
I would also say we could think more expansively about the definition of transit.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
I think my controversial thing that I've thought since I moved to the Portland region is that I moved from the Boston area, and transit system looks very different in the Boston area than it does here. And I came here, and one of the first things I noticed was the MAX running along 84 and the new senior affordable housing directly overlooking the freeway at the MAX station. And the thing I had done immediately before moving to Portland was a study on the health impacts of housing adjacent to freeways and how they are especially problematic for seniors and people who are, and for children. And I was like, wow, all right, so that's how we're doing it here, huh? And I think that there's good reasons why we end up putting transit where we do, because that's where it's the thing we can do. But then we put transit where it's feasible, and then we ask development to happen next to the transit. And sometimes that puts it in places that aren't the best places and that don't support infill and redevelopment and that don't create the kind of value that you need to deliver a bigger transformation. And so I think that's a real challenge with the way we plan our transit service and put in our infrastructure, and that kind of co-location of things that generate a lot of fumes and things that we want to serve lower income households is problematic.
Yeah, it's good, Becky.
I've got a quick one online. Michael, you spoke about apartments with a focus on the Portland metro area. I would also say you a number of mid-sized cities around the state. But Carla is interested in how you would change your approach for smaller cities, like $5,000 to $10,000 in rural or eastern or 10,000 people, sorry, in rural or eastern Oregon.
I try to be humble about my understanding specifically of rural and eastern Oregon because I haven't spent much time there. So I would, cities under 10,000 are not affected by ONA's accountability mandate, though they do have some responsibilities under state law. And so the easy answer is that we will, as a state, offer similar resources, and you can choose to use them to the best of your ability and time. To the extent that you find them useful. In like a Hermiston, a larger city east of the mountains, or a Newburgh-sized city west of the mountains, my opinion is that this is a perfectly viable way to allow housing, and a pretty important one. Part of the reason we don't have people with the business and the skills to build multifamily housing in Coos Bay is that it's illegal to build multifamily housing in Coos Bay, and that doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but it could happen.
Yeah, thank you. If you are in a jurisdiction that is interested in this kind of thing, that is, of the smaller size, talk to DLCD about housing implementation plans. I'm very interested to see how that's going to develop over the next couple of years.
Sam,
I know we've got a question over there.
Can I jump in on
Sure.
that a little bit too? I think it's interesting because in Michael's presentation, he also gave the great kind of ingredients that have gone into HB 2001 and CFEC being like the state telling the local jurisdictions something. There is something to be said for that, even when it comes to apartment complexes and 4-story buildings, because the sociology that occurs in the psychology at the local level, you have electeds, you have staff that are working so intimately with the community that it's scary. Like, just to be quite frank, of going against your community in their eyes by taking some very progressive or challenging steps towards density or to just different development standards. So having the state be the bad guy has been super helpful, quite frankly, from a local, if I could speak on behalf of electeds for sure, but definitely from a staff perspective of getting things that are needed, because those conversations can be just in a loop, and boards and commissions and councils change. So things just, yeah, anyways, I just want to point that out.
Can I jump in on that? I've got a riff on that. So there are three possible problems that are interfering with housing growth. There's technical problems, and the state has a fair number of ways it can help with that. There are fiscal problems, and the state has a limited number of ways it can help with that. And then there are political problems. I think those are the three basic categories of reasons we aren't building more housing. The purpose of the accountability system in a law like now housing needs law is to solve the political problems, to take the candy off the plate of the status quo and say, no, this status quo is unhealthy, and say, choose your peas or choose your carrots, but those are your options.
So, all right. This is like a two-part question. My first question, essentially, I hear you talking about building more infrastructure or building apartments, and what sizes are you in counting range for that? Just because I think specifically for BIPOC communities, we would love to have more people live in our homes. And we grew up in homes where it's like 20 people in one home. Maybe not the best thing, but hey, cheaper for all the bills. So there's that. And then the other part is, what kind of cultural assessments are you considering and or making or thinking about as you're having these conversations about building housing? Because I hear you talking a lot about where you want to build housing, but you're not talking about who you want to build that housing for. And so I just want to kind of figure out like what kind of information or what your brains are thinking, or what suggestions, recommendations, et cetera, you have to speak to that.
I can jump in a little bit real quick on some of that conversation. There's been a conversation the last couple of years, I think, for developers, for cities and communities to start thinking about multi-generational housing, whether that's multi-family or that's a single family type of style unit, but actually planning on having multiple groups and generations living under one roof and not disqualifying it with the zoning process. I can say that when I did some work in Happy Valley, this came up multiple times, and we did address our code to meet it and to allow for like multiple kitchens in some instances, and for bigger housing types. And that's certainly a conversation that we continue to have in Milwaukie. It doesn't answer your complete question, but I can say that there's a beautiful part in the community in that and disqualifying it through zoning or through code enforcement has been the issue for cities. And so decoupling that, pulling those back and allowing for it, first of all, is kind of our first step. And then how the development looks is kind of secondary.
My first place in Portland was a shared house in Kenton. I paid $450 a month. I had 3 roommates. We were all job earners, and we were absolutely displacing a family by living in this single family house. We didn't have any money to choose other options at the time, but we didn't have very many other options at the time. It seems to me that in terms of like unit size, right? We actually have quite an excess of large homes. They're just occupied by small households in Oregon. If we have a shortage, it's of small homes. And that doesn't say that a small home is right for everybody. Absolutely not. And we should be thinking about both things. But it seems to me that part of the answer to getting larger household size homes appropriate is to have an adequate supply of decent small homes. On the question of for whom, not just where, the ONA process does include, the state housing targets process does include a way to think about that is through a non-defined equity metric in the statute that needs to be sorted out. And I couldn't tell you how the state is on track to sorting that out, but it is supposed to be sorted out. The law says it's going to be sorted out. So we'll figure something out. So let's start working on that.
Well, one thing that we do have in place is contextualized housing need, right? That's something that I was really happy is included in the housing production strategies process, is that cities need to show how their housing production strategies are not just responsive to the number of units that they need, but who needs it and who has been shut out of the housing process so far. Now, that is not a guarantee that cities are going to take that into account. And that's why everyone in this room needs to be very involved in their local communities as these housing production strategies are being put together, and saying over and over and over again, is this responding to your contextualized housing need? All right, I think we had a question over here.
Sorry, can I add just one
Yeah.
other thought on that, which is a sort of small and slightly wonky piece, but I think it can make a difference in outcomes, is the way that if jurisdictions have incentives or requirements for affordability, like Portland has inclusionary zoning, and there's other jurisdictions that have more voluntary things, thinking about the distribution of units by size and incentives for larger units Because studios tend to be the thing where the gap between market rent and the affordable rent is the smallest. And so if you're asking market rate developers to produce affordable housing and you let them choose the unit size, they will tend to pick studio because that is going to hit their pro forma the least. And things like what Portland did that allow like count each bedroom as a unit, basically to create an incentive for putting in fewer larger units. You don't get as many, but you do get some larger units as opposed to getting all studios. And so I think those kind of details of how you structure the incentives and what kind of units need to be provided. I think that can help, especially if you are trying to use market rate development to deliver affordable housing.
Rachel.
Right. My question is, how do you change government culture? I've
Can we get
had,
Margaret Salazar back, please.
and I've had engineers tell me that some of the middle income infrastructure you were discussing was against their engineer morals. I've had special districts, all kinds of special districts, turn down property tax exemptions for affordable housing. So again, state policy is very helpful when it tells those districts or those engineers what has to be done. Bend is unique in a sense that we have a housing department that's separate from our development department. And so we advocate frequently. We started small with just one affordable housing coordinator. We now are a staff of 7. It takes that kind of fight to make culture change happen in government.
I love that. I appreciate that comment and concern. It's something that I'm a believer in government, local especially. I'm not in this because to make money, that's for sure. And if you are, there's something wrong, right? But I think one thing that has happened over the last couple of years is, in my experience working in local government, there's been a lot of just pulling apart and people believing that government is something because of the federal politics, because of whatever, and not realizing that there's actually some good people and that are trying to work within and really make those connections and really make those changes and have that customer service mentality. But what I worry about is that not enough good people are actually trying to get into the field anymore in government and help be that change on the inside, because for bad publicity, bad marketing, or whatever. So I want to encourage, this is another commercial. I would love to encourage, like, if you do have a heart for a community and for service, joining local government, yeah, you're not going to make tons of money. That's not the point. But if you want to change and become part of the process of making something better, you got to have patience and be incremental. Sometimes help turn up the heat at times. But that's certainly a big part of what needs to happen. Absolutely. And that's something that is a leadership. There's sometimes leadership vacuums in governments. And so if you can help fill that vacuum, please do.
The other thing I would say is the places where I've seen the best sort of cross-departmental collaboration, there has been some pretty strong leadership at the elected level in that jurisdiction that says, we are going to make this happen. This is a council priority. Because my husband is an engineer, he works for local government. I understand, like, there are a lot of competing priorities, there are a lot of other things you got to get done. There's like other state and federal mandates you got to meet. There's a lot else going on. And like making this one development happen is like, I'm trying to meet EPA standards. I'm trying to make sure that, like, you know, there's other issues maybe that feel more pressing. And I think some very clear, consistent leadership at the top is the thing that I've seen be most effective in like corralling towards speed and efficiency of the whole process, including public works or engineering.
All right, we do have to wrap up. So last question from the room, and I'll quickly note to people online, we are getting some good questions. I'm going to share the questions that I'm getting online with the panelists, and we can try and follow up with you if you continue to send those in. But yeah, last question from the room.
Thank you. This is more of a technical question. But I'm curious if there's a difference between ownership opportunities and rental opportunities. I rent a single family house. I would rather own a condo in a larger building in a more urban environment. But it seems like whenever we talk about what we're going to use our land to build, we talk about homes and apartments. So is there some sort of technical consideration, or how do we think about how we use our land in terms of ownership versus renters?
Construction defect liability reform. Is the short answer. There are a lot of, do you want to explain? It's very expensive to build condos right now because there are 10 years in which you can get sued for any problems with the construction, and there's an incentive for the condo association to bring a lawsuit for a variety of reasons. And so it means that condominiums in multi-story buildings have much higher liability risk and therefore cost. And so that's a challenge in a lot of states. It's a challenge in Oregon. It's something that state legislatures in a number of states have wrestled with. Washington made some progress on paper that hasn't really filtered down to changing how things really work in practice. It's a tough issue. It's a state level issue, and it's a legal issue of like who can sue who for how long over what things, and then how that responsibility gets allocated. But it's a real strong deterrent to anyone in the construction or development industry touching condominium projects, especially multi-story buildings where like one person's water leak becomes millions and millions and millions of dollars of damage.
And a bunch of other people to potentially join the lawsuit.
Yes.
I was talking to a fellow from Turner Center in California yesterday about this, and the numbers he was citing were larger than I realized. He said that in the state where he was looking, 30 to 40% of the cost of condo development was related to the risk of that lawsuit. And so what New Jersey did was they said, you're going to pay 17% of your entire project cost into a fund that will make it so that we'll compensate people that way instead of a legal process. So you don't have the arms race on the lawyer's side. 17% on top of everything. That's a big amount, but he
it's a
said
known
that,
amount.
but it's a known amount. Exactly. So in New Jersey, it's something like 30 to 40% of multifamily development is condos right now.
All right. Well, thank you again to fantastic panelists, Joseph, Michael, and Becky.